Oh, so my last video got copyright struck. No, not the April Fool's one, though I hope you enjoyed it. I told Naomi that she should actually do a VTuber channel. I'd even help her with it, but it seems like she doesn't want to. If you want though, guys, you can always keep trying to convince her. No, my last real video, Don't Follow the Trends, got a copyright strike. It was nominally about Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars, as well as the Chinese Olympics. But the actual topic was about the rising expectation of people to engage with society in a certain way. The whole point of being an outsider, the point of punk, to turn a phrase, is to specifically go against the trend. There's a meme on the right that if your point of view is parroted by every academic institution, every government official, every corpo and their HR department, every celebrity and newscaster, you're not punk, you're not alt, you're not going against the trend, you are part of it. At this point though, the video is thankfully back online, but while I was in the middle of making it, I actually had a hunch that it would catch some heat, because I used the full clip of the Will Smith Oscars slap, and I figured that whoever puts on the Oscars would get their panties in a bunch about it. But no, it actually wasn't them at all. Instead, it was British GQ, because I used a clip from Helen Lewis's 2018 interview of Jordan Peterson. In that interview, no, I'm not dumb enough to bring up the clip again, it was an automated YouTube strike. Peterson made the point to Lewis that if somebody is fully ideological in their thinking, you only need to talk to them for a few minutes before you can predict what answers they have for any given question. These people aren't actually thinking. They're filtering the inputs you give them through a lens that distills them down into an ideological talking point. They're basically running on autopilot. I liken this to a Markov chain for conversations in the blocked video, and that this type of thinking is supported by the trending pages on social media, full of meaningless garbage that nobody actually cares about. These trending pages promote not just trending topics, both artificial and organic, but also the idea that everybody must have an opinion on the current thing. If you don't, then you're not properly engaging with society, and because everything is political, your neutrality is inherently offensive. In other words, refusing to walk the walk, refusing to virtue signal, especially if you have, say, a large platform, is now considered just as bad as being a legitimate fascist, at least to the terminally online radical activists. The reason that I'm rehashing this stuff from the last video isn't just because it got the ban hammer, and a lot of you probably haven't seen it. It's also because that lensing idea deserves a bit more exploration than I had the time to give it in the video about Will Smith in the trending tab. I recently spoke to a Boy on my channel. I spoke to him twice, in fact, but I'm talking about the second time. Yeah, I know you guys don't like him. I may politically disagree with him on things, but that doesn't mean that I have to hate the guy. This is what actual neutrality looks like. It's being friends with people that you also have disagreements with. I honestly kind of laugh at some of the comments from people who say, OMG, Dev, how could you have him on? Like I'm some kind of socialist who deplatforms and cancels everybody who's not me. No, that's not who I am. But during that second conversation, we were talking about the contributions of the Austrian school to mainstream economics. These contributions include the subjective theory of value, that the value of an economic good is not determined by any inherent property, nor by the amount of labor necessary to produce it, but by the importance the individual places on it for their own ends. The law of diminishing marginal utility, that the benefit derived from consuming a product tends to change depending on how many previous identical products have been consumed. Like how you might highly enjoy your first piece of cake, only somewhat enjoy your second, feel neutral about your third, and feel sick after your fourth, giving each piece of cake a different subjective value to you despite being identical products. And the economic calculation problem, that any centralized redistribution effort lacks the on-the-ground knowledge to be able to efficiently distribute any commodities, as the central planners do not have the knowledge or experience that decentralized individuals do. In other words, a government can't replicate the total knowledge of every person living under it, and so a command economy will always be less efficient than a free market. These are all real innovations in economics, and they all came from the Austrian school. But as I was talking to a Boy about it, I was reminded of this quotation from Friedrich Hayek. The greatest success of a school is that it stops existing because its fundamental teachings have become parts of the general body of commonly accepted thought. Hayek was talking about those Austrian contributions to mainstream econ, because even though they were formulated by Austrian economics, it turned out that they were so correct that they just got absorbed by the mainstream of the field. Let me describe to you a concept that I'm sure somebody else before me has coined it, but I don't know what it's called. I call it correct enough. The truth, the real truth of anything, is almost always entirely incomprehensible by human minds. Consider the mug on my desk, made of ceramic. When I'm drinking out of it, it's correct enough for me to consider it an object that holds liquid, because that's what I'm using it for. But if I had to describe it to you, that's not correct enough anymore. I need to tell you roughly its size and shape and color for you to understand the nature of the mug. If you wanted to buy an identical mug, this is also not enough information, because I would also need to tell you the price and where I bought it. If you wanted a more detailed makeup of the mug, where the ceramic came from, how it was made, then it's still not correct enough. To a scientist interested in studying the mug on the atomic level, I would need to zoom in on the mug so much that we could identify the atoms that the ceramic is composed of. That would be alumina, rock salt, and magnesium oxide, by the way. And that those atoms were in fact constantly moving and vibrating around. And that the distinction between the mug and the non-mug, atomically, is purely conceptual, imposed by my brain for my purposes, since it's all just atomic particles anyway. And then, if you wanted to get even more serious, even that's not correct enough. There's actually no particles out there in the world at all. That's a convenient fiction that we tell ourselves to be able to get an intuitive handle on physics. The reality is that it's all just clouds of amplitude that exist within a configuration space, and what my brain recognizes as a mug is just a large wave function that just so happened to factorize, having no separate existence any more than anything else does. The real world is actually pretty unknowable by human standards. We like to think that we're rational beings that can comprehend anything, but reality is actually utterly alien to us. Our senses take in what they can, and we focus on what we desire, because that's the only way that humans can function, and that's what correct enough means. It's almost impossible to get anything right, as in to describe the universe perfectly accurately. The amount of information contained within any one thing is theoretically infinite, but it is entirely within our grasp to get things right, as in to establish something that approximates the truth enough that we can use it to achieve our goals. That's why I don't need to understand quantum mechanics to be able to drink from my mug. I just need to know that it doesn't have a hole in it. That level of resolution is enough to accomplish my goal, hence it is correct enough. In general, Newtonian physics works in everyday situations because it's correct enough. General relativity is more correct, but it's also significantly more detailed. Check this out. This was used in one of my psychology classes back in university. Yes, I know that Jordan Peterson also uses it in one of his lectures. I didn't actually take his lectures back in the day. I think this is just a common psych thing. Depending on what level of resolution you focus on, you can divide this image up into multiple groupings, and each one feels intuitively correct in your own head as you do so, meaning that from your perspective, the world appears to change as you change your focus. And what constitutes correct depends on what level of resolution you're operating on, all the way down to the makeup of the atoms that constitute this image, if it were printed on a piece of paper, all the way up to recognizing the image as a single unitary thing, the image, with no constituent parts. Each of these views is correct enough, as long as it aligns with your purposes. And it's not just a physics thing, this is how our brains operate everywhere, all the time. When primitive tribal people saw an eclipse for the first time, they believed it to be a mystical divine event. They were absolutely incorrect, but they were correct enough for their purposes. The goals of a tribal being to maintain social cohesion, something that a shared religious narrative can help accomplish. A pure materialist, a Marxist, let's say, will hear all of this and say that it's all just chemicals in the brain, so it's not real, it's not worth anything, it's not worth consideration. But, hypocrite that he is depending on chemicals in his brain to tell them that they are chemicals in the first place. He is not actually the purely rational, disembodied spirit caged in a prison of flesh like he claims to be, able to peer directly at the nature of the universe, if only he were more free. His intelligence is built upon the physical world. His brain is a thing, after all, and it exists in a physical location where his conscious experience and mental processing specifically happens. And so he is also subject to these forces. He can only ever be correct enough. For as much as he claims to truly be objective, to truly trust the science, he can only ever be correct enough. Remember those Austrian innovations in economics becoming part of mainstream thought because they were, let's say, correct enough? They spoke to an economic truth that wasn't simply a part of any one specific ideology, but instead was so correct that it became part of the total discipline. We might say that those innovations transcended their initial resolution. They didn't only work here, but they also worked there and there and there. The purpose of a school of thought, whether that's in economics, or in physics, or in psychology, or philosophy, or anywhere else, is to put forward ideas that may not necessarily be mainstream in the whole of their field, but that contribute to the tapestry of thought that is the school. And as HYUK said, when an idea that began in a school sees that much success, it leaves the school and becomes mainstream. In other words, it becomes adopted by all the other schools in the field since evidence for it is overwhelming. I think that a school of thought is roughly analogous to what people on the left like to call a lens. Remember Destiny saying at one point, on some stream that I can't find, sorry, that it's useful to understand various lenses, but not to dogmatically hold them, because occasionally looking at an issue through a lens might provide new insight. In the same vein, it's a good idea to understand multiple schools of thought in a given field, because if one school of thought can't really tackle a problem, maybe an insight from another school can help you out. Here's a great example. I'm not a progressive or an intersectionalist, but the intersectionalist lens can be useful at times to view things from a different perspective and gain new information, even if you would not agree with the prescriptions of that school of thought. For example, every leftoid screeching about how America is institutionally racist, that the laws are anti-black, the cops are anti-black, the culture is anti-black, they just seem to be incorrect. That doesn't mean that those things didn't once exist, and there hasn't been some snowballing effects. Intergenerational wealth is an important part of climbing from working class to middle class, and if past racism has broken the black family, then that intergenerational wealth doesn't exist for them. Even if nobody alive now actually committed any of those acts, and the legitimate racism has been removed from the legal system, that doesn't mean that black people don't still face some kind of uphill battle. In the same vein, I'm not an ANCAP, but I find Hobbes' conception of time preference and his theory of property in a post-scarcity society to be two useful tools to help analyze other ideas. For example, one of Hobbes' contentions with communism is that there can never truly be a stateless, moneyless, classless, post-scarcity society, because even if every good and service are infinite and provided freely, there are still some scarce resources, namely your body, your time, and downstream from those two, your attention. You would still need to hold exclusive ownership and domain over those things, and you would still need to negotiate trade with others who want those things from you. That requires a conception of property that is not communal in nature but individualistic, and everything else that is capitalist flows downstream from that position. The problem is when you become ideologically attached to one school, one lens, that you dogmatically filter everything through it without even thinking, and you mindlessly accept the answer that it spits out without checking whether or not it maps onto reality. Socialists do this, ANCAPs do this, intersectionalists and progressives do this, religious conservatives do this. They all have a rigid set of ideas, books or rules or laws or views that they feed every possible stimuli into. How does this relate to the bourgeoisie's class war against the proletariat? How did state regulation cause this market failure? How is it a product of a patriarchal society and the privilege power dynamic? What does Jesus and the Bible have to say about it? All of these can be useful questions to ask that might provide some insight, but for none of them is it appropriate to ask them, and only ask them, nothing else, every single time. The proper use for a school of thought isn't to follow it constantly, even when it's obviously wrong. The proper use of a lens isn't to keep it hooked up to your eye 24/7. If you do, that's why you can't understand what's going on around you. You're restricting your vision. It's to understand how these structures work, but to be open to new ideas. It's to keep them in your back pocket as a potential mode of analysis that might occasionally yield a good result. Because you're not a disembodied being looking for the truth. You are not nearly smart enough for that. None of us are. You are looking to solve a problem, whatever the problem is. And if a new way of looking at the problem might help solve it, why wouldn't you do so? You don't need to follow that way dogmatically. You're not swearing an oath to it. You're solving a problem. That was the point of that Helen Lewis Jordan Peterson clip that I used, the one that got me copyright struck. Lewis said that she found Peterson confusing because he didn't seem to have an ideology that he operated from. And Peterson correctly told her that you don't need one. And in fact, having one basically destroyed her ability to independently think. He was right. That's how he predicted her responses before she gave them, by simply adopting her lens. That's the correct position, by the way. Don't be ideological, or at least be as non-ideological as you can. But as I said at the beginning, if you're not ideological, you are stupidly called a racist, fascist, bigot, Nazi, whatever nowadays with the terminally online radical activists. They expect an ideology like Lewis did. They expect you to dance the dance, to perform for them, and to observe their performances. Doing so socially signals that you have the correct thoughts, that you're on the right side of history. And if you don't, then you're the enemy, because everything is political. So if you disengage from anything, then you are opposing their politics. You are the wrench thrown into their next 5-year plan. So I'll leave you with the same moral lesson as the last video, since you probably didn't get to hear it. Only make a show of caring about something if you actually care about it. You have no obligation to care about everything, or anything, regardless of what they say. And if you do want to resist them, then you have an obligation to be stubborn and obstinate in your not caring. The house of cards that they sit atop collapses every time you just say no. So say it loud and say it proud.